Welcome to the Weekly Wrap. I'm here today joined by Harrison Pitt, contributing editor at the European Conservative, and of course by Connor Tomlinson and obviously myself, Luke Daniel. We're going to talk about the German elections and some of the interesting developments there. Doge, any sort of, well, the impact's been over here, I suppose, and also ARC, which we were all in attendance at last week, and we'll just discuss our reflections on that. Starting with the German elections, it was pretty interesting when you look at the breakdown in age and also gender. What were the trends that we were seeing?
So as I wrote about for Courage, so the CDU got 28%, AfD came in second at 20.8%. People were very bullish, especially after Elon Musk's endorsement, this X-Space with Alice Weidel, that they might be able to be an insurgent populist force, upending the German political order, but it seems like they've just switched from SPD back to Merkel's old party. Instead, Die Linke got 8.8%, and what was very pronounced about this is the age and sex breakdown demographic, the political gender polarization that Ian's written about before, is that young women were 25% more likely than the national average to vote for Die Linke, which is the legacy party to the German Communist Party, whereas young men, which we keep getting told, us three are driving toxic masculinity and political polarization, were only 4% more likely than the national average to vote for the AfD. So young women's left-wing radicalism is causing the massive gap. And then there was an intergenerational gap as well, because it was 20% for AfD, 21%, and 23% for Die Linke, 18 to 24, versus 25% for the SPD and 42% for the CDU for German over 70s, so German boomers. I think it was 2 million voters switched from Scholz's SPD to the CDU, mainly driven by over 70s. And what I think is behind this, it shouldn't be controversial to anyone, is that those most proximate to the atrocities of the Second World War are those most sensitive to voting against anything that seems like political extremism, particularly the cordon sanitaire put around the AfD, which are, for all intents and purposes, like a market liberal nationalist party, but the 124 legislators that tried to ban them under the German post-war constitution as far-right Nazis, over 70s will be very concerned of being smeared for voting for that party, or whether or not the smears about that party are particularly true, because never again became the modus operandi of the German state after the Holocaust, because of course nobody wants to repeat the Holocaust, and so they are averse to supporting that party, it seems. Right,
okay, so you don't just think it's sort of the boomer phenomenon of, wanting to protect your property prices and continuing to vote for the status quo. You think they actually do have this sort of deep-seated fear of tyranny, of the right?
Well, I think that's also a geographical thing, because if you looked at the breakdown, the elections that happened last year, the regional elections in East Germany, it was Saxony and Thuringia, the AfD came out top, and if you look at the breakdown this time around, the highest concentration of AfD support is in East Germany, that was not subjected to the denazification programs that West Germany were, the sort of new post-war brand of democracy, which was that rather than democracy being one man, one vote and being sort of expression of English liberalism, it is that it's the mechanism by which our natural human egalitarianism is realised, which is why all of the German politicians threw an absolute fit when J.D. Vance said, well, you can't censor your way to democracy. The MAGA camp, I think AfD are very much in this, are very much like liberal democracy means old English liberal principles, or the continental adaptation therein, and then all of the German centrist parties, the sort of gatekeepers, are very much post-war liberal democracy.
Relies on denazification.
Yeah, our modus operandi is anti-racism and egalitarianism.
And it's fundamentally managerialist instead of trusting of the people, which liberal democracy necessarily must be. They fear the people as incipiently tyrannical, and in the case of Germany, as incipiently revanchist, or as incipiently, Nazism could happen again. That's and I think that to boomers, they're much more alive to those concerns than younger generations of Germans are. Although I do think that there probably is a certain amount of luxury belief thinking that enters into it as well, not least because they probably live in the areas in Germany that are more remote from the consequences of the mass demographic experiment through which Germans have been living for a good many decades now, and they're just more. they are by far the most active demographic in Germany in terms of voting. I don't have the figures exactly off the top of my head, but suffice it to say that certainly a plurality and perhaps even a majority of people who show up to vote are in that over 70s category. And for them, there is a long-running tradition in German politics called the firewall against the right. Brandmauer is the term in German. It's a core part of post-war German political culture, and it basically it's a sort of mythology that is built up around the fact that three very naive Germans in particular in the early 1930s, Schleicher, Papen, and Hindenburg, they didn't like Hitler. They thought that he was a sort of lower middle class peasant. They didn't trust him at all. They thought he was a lowly corporal, but they realized that he was increasingly popular in the 1930s, and they thought that by bringing him into the German government, they could trust him. And they rather underestimated his political cunning and indeed his future plans for Germany. So these people, Schleicher, Hindenburg, and Papen, they were sort of the Prussian aristocratic right in Germany at the time who trusted Hitler. And the fear is among people, boomers who lean overwhelmingly in favor of the CDU, and some of them lean in favor of the SPD, is that the AfD, to some extent, Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party, to some extent represents a reincarnation of that struggle, and they don't want to be the next Schleicher, the next Papen, and the next... I keep forgetting his name, and Hindenburg, by bringing them into government, that would be an unwise thing to do. So they have this idea of a Brandmauer, a kind of firewall against the far right. The ironic thing is that Schleicher, Papen, and Hindenburg, if they're around today, would probably regard the AfD as sort of incorrigibly left-wing. But
yeah, I was going to say the candidate for the next Hitler being a lesbian in a relationship with a Sri Lankan immigrant
and winning 27% of the gay vote, which the AfD just did. By the way, they wouldn't have been as keen on that.
Well, the rights young men are a bit more attractive.
Well, yeah, maybe that's
the situation is rich in ironies.
But going back to the gender and the age point, young men reject this, right? They're completely rejecting this. So between the ages of 18 and 24, I think 25% of men voted for the AfD, 34% of women, compared to 14% for the left-wing party, 34% of women voted for Die Linke, with only 15% voting for the AfD. So that's a huge bifurcation. Why do we think that is happening?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that women are, in general, not exclusively, but in general, they tend to, an evolutionary...
And by the way, they're not voting for the CDU. Or
not voting for the
SPD
CDU either, right? No. But the evolutionary psychology seems to tell us that women are generally, in terms of their psychological modality, more agreeable than men, and that therefore they are more likely to line up and behind what they perceive to be the dominant culture. And there are good evolutionary reasons why women might be more that way, more risk-averse, whereas men would be more risk-taking. A good example I like to use to demonstrate this, just as a kind of thought experiment, think of sort of lockdown mask era hysteria. It's very conceivable that there might be a wife and a husband who both think that masks are a completely pointless exercise on an aeroplane, but who is it who's going to be complaining to the stewardess? Is it going to be the wife, or is it going to be the husband? It could be the wife, but more likely is that it will be the husband, because it tends to be men who push the boundaries a little bit more in terms of breaking out of social norms. And because the dominant culture in Germany at the moment, which Connors has hinted at already, and in the West at large, is a kind of woke, coded one, it makes sense that women line up more behind that than men do. And it's not an indictment on all women. There are certainly lots of women, not least Alice Weidel, who has a very senior leadership position in the Alternative for Deutschland party. But if we're trying to sort of dissect general demographic trends, I would imagine that has a lot to do with it. The one positive point that I would make on this is that precisely because again, at scale, women's loyalties towards Die Linke and more left-wing parties, viewing them as the future, precisely because those sentiments and those loyalties are actually quite fickle when you think about it. It's not as though they're all studiously studying Die Linke's policy manifesto proposals or anything like that. If there were, over the next 5 years, to be a serious burst of energy in the direction of AfD, when we might see women joining that movement for precisely the same reasons that they currently feel it's in their best evolutionary interest to join Die Linke. We're already seeing that somewhat with the Trump movement at the moment. I don't know about you, Connor, but when I go to these sorts of events, whether it's here or in America, there are more women there than there were 5 years ago, and it's possible that Germany may catch up in that respect in 5 years' time.
But the New York Magazine example was the front page that was saying the cruel kids table, and it was the photograph of the inauguration party party that was sponsored by TikTok, that had lots of attractive young influencers there. And it was interesting because it's very much we're watching two TV screens playing the same film but coming away from different interpretations. They thought this made MAGA look terrible. In fact, it made it look high status, attractive, competent and rich. Yeah. And these are all the things that cause a cultural preference cascade. In the model of my friend Mary Harrington's phrase, culture is downstream from what the hot girls want. So if you hot girl code right-wing politics, I think you're going to get a lot more of them going, and that high level of social conformity will go there, especially because left-wing politics has an enforcement cost that tells women to act against their own interests. This is why Britain, for example, has become Turf Island around the issue of women's safety in sports and changing rooms. This is why National Rally is seeing unprecedented gender parity between young men and young women voting for them, because the French feminists haven't gone all in for the trans stuff, and they see immigration as a women's safety issue. So, and also they find Jordan Bardella a little bit dishy, so they're going to back that. And this is why you're seeing also more young women voting for Trump, not just because of the prominent examples like Lincoln Riley and other young women that were murdered by illegal immigrants, but also because if you want to go to the sorority parties, and all the strapping young lads are voting Trump, and all of the sorority sisters are also now voting Trump, then you want to be in that social group, and so right-wing politics becomes the ascendant culture. And that hasn't happened here yet. It clearly hasn't happened in Germany yet. Maybe give it a few more years.
Right, so people sort of respond to power, and success accrues success.
Exactly.
And I suppose the fact of the matter is that the younger age group, whether they're voting left, whether they're voting right, are rejecting their status quo. I suppose, hopefully, sort of the Linke vote share will go down in the future. But if it doesn't, these two differing opinions on how we are to order our state and how we should treat people coming from outside will have to be negotiated, and it won't have any reference to the last sort of 50 years of German history.
Well, the thing that I regard as very insidious about left-wing politics, not just in Germany, I suspect, which I know less about, but also here and in the United States, is that the really insidious thing about it is in terms of how it pitches to women. It sells a kind of ersatz fake rebellion. It sells a very clear case of conformity as ersatz rebellion. So it will sort of say to people, look, you're voting against the system here. You're being a radical. You're being a revolutionary. Meanwhile, the Archbishop of Canterbury agrees with you.
Every C-suite executive,
every C-suite executive agrees with you. It may not be the case that Olaf Scholz, the leader of the SPD, or Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CDU, agrees with you, but he's certainly not going to counter-signal you in the way that those people will counter-signal the AfD. It sells conformity as rebellion, and so women, again, being generally more conformist, there's a particular attraction in that, because you have all of the exhilaration of revolution or counter-revolution, or however you want to phrase it, without any of the risks attached to it. Whereas men tend to be more drawn to genuine risk-taking. And at the moment, there's no question that the real revolutionary movement, or as I would rather call it, counter-revolutionary movement in Germany is the AfD. But it will need to be perceived as culturally ascendant before you will get young German women joining it en masse. But don't underestimate the pace with which the preference cascade that Connor talks about can get underway.
But it's worth reminding ourselves that men are also highly conformist, and at first we're talking about the margin.
Human beings
are nudging at the margin. You have this preference cascade.
There's a UK parallel here that again shows the divide between young men and young women. Is that at the last election, Reform, being a very nascent political party that had 0 MPs and had no hope in hell until Nigel Farage returned to lead it, became the joint top party for young men. It was Labour and then Reform. For young women, it was far and away Labour, with massive growth in the Green Party. And the hilarious thing about the ersatz revolution is, of course, the rallying cry of Labour, particularly among young people, is F the Tories, austerity, all these betrayals, climate change. It's like this Conservative Party have caused debt to eclipse GDP. There was one point where Gove invited Greta Thunberg to Parliament. It's like, what do you think you're actually rebelling against? Whereas the true rebellion, at least in the way that they're marketing themselves, we might quibble about the strength of their policies, is Reform, and it's coming up on the rightward flank, and it doesn't seem to have attracted lots of young female support, but it has attracted quite a bit of young male support in its early days.
Let me just say, to clarify, yes, I think that most human beings are generally conformist, as what's he called, as the writer George Bernard Shaw once said, he said, what did he say? He said 2% of people think, 3% of people think they think, and 95% of people would rather die than think. So I think that no
prescient
one
for George Bernard Shaw, considering his visits to the Soviet Union.
This is true, but no biological sex has a monopoly either on conformity or rebellion. But in general, women are more conformist than men, and like general metrics do have very significant consequences when it comes to election patterns.
And we've sort of seen them here.
Yeah.
I think we just touched on it earlier, but we might as well touch on it again. Gays for AFD, similar phenomenon. What's going on? What's that all about? 27.9%, I think, amongst the 18 to 24 age group, which is far and away the most popular party.
Well, I think some of them are keen not to be thrown off buildings at some point in the future.
So that, I mean,
I think it probably does have a certain amount to do with that. I mean, but also. So in addition to being concerned about the gradual Islamization of Germany and what that would mean for what freedoms homosexuals at the moment do have in Germany, I also imagine it has something to do with the way in which the left has tried to throw out beauty standards in the last 20 to 30 years. There is a belief among kind of wokesters today that to even to talk in terms of things being objectively beautiful or objectively ugly, well, our beauty standards are socially constructed, and they're socially constructed to serve power. There's all of this, people write books like "Women Don't Owe You Beauty" and all the rest of it. And if at the same time the right is leaning into a kind of renaissance of celebrating virility, celebrating masculinity, actually making sure that you are clean shaven, making sure that you cut your hair properly. Like I think one of the most was using the word dishy again. Like one of the dishier activists on the German right at the moment is a man called Martin Sellner, who looks. I can see why a gay man might find him attractive or interesting. So I don't think that we should underestimate the aesthetic considerations that go into that as well. Just as you will often find gay people being disproportionately high Tory or high church because they like the smells and bells and all that sort of thing.
It's a taste thing.
I think it has.
Once they're there, they've gone all the way.
Yes, exactly. Fear of being thrown off buildings and sort of a heightened aesthetic sensibility at a time when the left is openly celebrating ugliness. I think all these things are probably important inputs into that level of support. I think it was. We should say the figures. If I didn't say it earlier, maybe I did. 27% of gays voted for.
27.9, 28% basically,
which is quite extraordinary. And I imagine it was an even higher proportion of younger gays. So.
Yeah, I mean the next in line was Greens with 19.9%.
That's less good. You need to work on that.
It's like Vance. He just said on the Joe Rogan podcast, "Look, I think the Republican Party this time around is just going to get the normal gay guy vote."
Yeah, the normal gay guy. Yes, exactly.
There you go.
That was very entertaining. Okay, cool. So speaking of Vance and the US, Doge has turned up some sort of interesting things recently. Have you been writing about it?
I have been covering it, not for Courage, but I do plan to at some point. I've also just been out in the US echoing calls for a Trump-style revolution.
Oh yeah, you're at CPAC.
How
is this all going down at CPAC?
CPAC was very different to ARC. ARC is very much a talking shop, whereas CPAC is a Trump rally with a revolving door of familiar faces, basically. But America is jubilant, they're culturally ascendant, they're unafraid to be patriotic, and there is very much the feeling that even if the scope of Doge's operation isn't as large as we would like, there was a Wall Street Journal article recently that said they haven't quite cut 55 billion, they've only cut a couple of billion. I mean, any number of DEI contracts being cut is fine by me, But even if it's not as large as we would like, there is the intent and momentum behind the Trump revolution to say we're going to deliver back accountability, fiscal and democratic, to the American government, cut the bloated deep state, etc. And Lord knows we need it here. What was interesting this week is the complaints that Musk was cutting. First of all, there was a very revealing NBC article that said the American black middle class, especially since the 1960s, has been entirely reliant on government jobs to elevate black people out of poverty. Like they were complaining, for example, that of the 70-odd Department for Education workers that Doge has already sacked, 60 were black. There's something like, I can't remember, it might have been 30%, or it might have been 2/3 even, of all black women with a graduate degree have then gone to work for the government. for an extended period of time. So it's just some sort of, race activist patronage scheme. There was an interview with the Houston IRS worker, I think again on NBC, where he was saying he was in charge of compliance for NGOs and tax exemption, and he can't believe he got fired. It's like, oh, won't someone please think of the poor tax collectors who are the lowest of the low in the Bible, But then the other thing that came out this week, and Tulsi Gabbard has already sacked, I think, 100 people over it. So it's adjacent to Doge, ridding the institution of these ideologically captured barnacles who are sucking up taxpayer money, is that Chris Rufo over at City Journal turned up the internal chats of the NSA, and they were talking about their sexual fetishes, their polycules, laser anal hair removal for trans employees on work hours, as well as saying that Ben Shapiro and Libs of TikTok should be ejected from the tribe for hate speech, and trying to block the appointments of RFK and Tulsi Gabbard, and again democratically elected appointments, on the grounds that they're Russian assets and spreading misinformation. So it's good that it's getting all out there. It's good that there is an initiative to gut said deep state financially, clip the wings of the international leftist patronage network, and fire loads of people. The only thing I would hope is that they take notice of the stuff that we're writing at Courage. I had a great two-parter on how the Department of Justice's Community Relations Service has created like a patronage scheme for Islamists that they have to consult any time that there is a terror attack. And this is enabled mainly by Title 10 of the Civil Rights Act and a 2009 hate speech bill. If Trump were to just delete those via executive order, you could easily just remove that entire institution, and the Department of Justice, FBI, and that wouldn't have to go to these diversity grifting initiatives, cap in hand, saying, please sort out our community relations for us. So good start, want to import it, needs to be grander.
Well, I mean, in many ways, we already are sort of importing it and feeling some of the effects. They keep cropping up these stories of USAID funding all sorts of strange and nefarious things here in Britain and in various other places in Europe. I think Stonewall recently said they were going to have to lay off 80 staff because of cuts coming downstream from USAID.
Rory Stewart's wife.
Rory Stewart's wife's charities lost £1 million or something like that. Anyway, but it's interesting the point that you sort of raised there. So do you really see the whole point of Doge, or sort of the usefulness of it, not so much as a way to balance the books, but really to gut the deep state and the sort of NGO quangrocracy which has emerged around Washington?
You're shaking your head, so come and...
Yeah, I mean, the real... Okay, so I'm not as much of a fiscal hawk as some libertarians. I do care, though, about balanced budgets, like not for their own sake, like some autist might, but because I think that it's wrong.
Why'd you look at me?
No comment.
Because I think it's wrong to saddle your future generations with debt. I think it's immoral. I think it counts against all of the sort of sound, morally conservative Burkean principles. So yeah, I do care about that sort of thing, of course, a bit. But what I was going to say is that I think I'll say a good thing first before coming up with a slight criticism. I mean, I'm going to start with the criticism first. The real thing that's a problem in the US, and the real thing that's going to lead to greater debts for future generations, is America's very intricate system of like Medicare, Medicaid, entitlement reforms, exactly the sort of things that people like Paul Ryan and the Tea Party were keen to raid in sort of around 2012. And for obvious reasons, that became very electorally unpopular because the bulk of the sort of Republican voting movement were sort of, boomer conservatives who wanted to claim Medicaid and wanted to claim Medicare. So when we're talking about balancing the American budget, you're not going to get anything done until you're willing to touch those forms of discretionary spending. So I don't think that this is going to be any kind of salvo for America in fiscal terms. It's not going to solve America's fiscal crisis. However, I do think what it does show, and this is the good thing, is that there is, I've wondered this for a while, I've wondered how we haven't been able, on broadly speaking the right, to get a certain amount of fiscal conservatism and libertarianism mixed in with a sort of philosophy of cultural renewal and restoration, and people have viewed these things as separate. You're either a sort of a libertarian economic policy wonk, or you're interested in culture. And I think what this shows is that, well, when all sorts of insidious movements within the culture are receiving state-funded patronage, you can actually get libertarian-minded tech bros like Elon Musk, who I expect at heart is a sort of spiritual 90s libertarian, although he may be evolving a little bit politically. But if you can sort of get those sorts of concerns about efficiency which libertarians have, mixed in with a desire to make sure that all sorts of anti-civilizational entropic movements aren't receiving state funding, then that's a very promising nascent movement politically, and I'm very keen to import that kind of thinking here. You're already seeing it a little bit with people like Rupert Lowe in Britain, pointing to the way in which immigration isn't just culturally devastating, it's also a drag on our economy, and it's also a drag on our sort of fiscal system, and all those sorts of things. So there is real promise there. However, you're not going to balance. The Department of Government Efficiency could do the most thorough job in the world, and it would only be, in terms of targeting these cultural things, and it would only be trimming around the edges unless it was willing to go after entitlements, which I suspect, for electoral reasons, Donald Trump won't authorize them to do.
Well, I think so for electoral reasons, they certainly won't, because I did a piece a little while ago on whether or not the Democrats can recover, and Trump has pushed them into a very thin and unpopular sliver of the Overton window, where based on DEI criteria, they've hired idiots like Jasmine Crockett who cannot form coherent sentences, so that's just an in-kind campaign contribution to the Republicans. But two, if they've occupied the space of economic populism, they've got the disaffected Bernie bros, while also using Doge to appease the libertarians. They formed a broad economic tent, and then they fight on very popular culture war issues, which is 80% of the population, which is why he grew his voter base. But so not just that, I agree that Doge is not trying to balance the books, because the other proposal they had the other day was that we could take all the savings of Doge and give them out as like non-printed stimulus checks. So that's fostering voter-based loyalty. It's not worried about fiscal restraint. What it is, it's sending a dog down the rabbit hole to chase all of these like creatures that have been lurking beneath the American state without any accountability, out of hiding. This was that email that Musk sent the other day, the sort of Office Space, what do you actually do here thing. A third of government employees replied, not because Musk has any actual executive power to fire them, only Trump can do that, but that was just a test to see who's working from home and who's quiet quitting and who's doing non-compliance, right? Doge is a sword of Damocles hanging over the seat of power. And the seat of power currently resides in the unelected, unaccountable deep state. They're trying to dismantle that rather than just balance the books. If you wanted to balance the books, you would have to touch entitlements, and I think for electoral reasons, they're probably not going to do that.
Yeah, that's great. I also, like, coming back to your point just then, I think that's fascinating. Obviously, within conservatism, especially sort of post-liberal sort of conservatism, we've spent a really, really long time trying to disaggregate the sort of libertarian impulse from the sort of love of home, conservative, sense. But this suggests that we could get some of these people back on board, the libertarians, the free market people, and sort of turbocharge social reform that way.
Exactly.
And we could do that here in Britain.
Exactly, so long as they're willing to be junior partners. I would never put them in charge of the whole endeavour, because I think that the love of home is prior to the love of the way in which that home is economically constituted. This is why I have argued in the past, rather pompously, but I'll repeat it nevertheless, that what conservatives should be doing is trying to recover the original Greek meaning of the term economy. You need to have a home, oikos, before you discuss the rules, nomos, best suited to its material flourishing. So as long as the love of home is prior, then there's no reason why these people can't be admitted as junior partners. But if you put them in charge of the whole thing, you'll quickly find that you don't have any home worth living in, because they will only be prioritizing abstract, spreadsheet level, ultra economizing criteria.
And these are some of the ideas and tensions that present themselves at a conference like ARC, for example, where you have sort of often American libertarians, evangelical Christians coming up against people, more like yourself, with sort of love of home, sort of oikophilia, and sometimes it seems a bit schizophrenic and erratic. I mean, is that your sense of the ARC conference?
The sense I actually got was the sort of left behind liberals and intellectual dark web types who are acting like Biden's still in the White House, bizarrely, who didn't reckon with the you can just do things Trump revolution at all on stage. David Brooks, got up and condemned Trump. That's why are you here? But not just that.
I happen to think that was sort of a masterclass in oratory, though. I would encourage people to listen. I would encourage people to listen to that speech. And I agreed with a lot of what you said.
So is Marx's Communist Manifesto, but I wouldn't wipe my backside with the contents. And so I don't actually think the evangelical Christians run up necessarily against our sense of home at all, because I still agree with Christianity being the moral substrate of British life. It's not the only thing to it, but it's an important component. I actually think the issue you had was the people that were offering a sort of bland British values, platitudinous. You can buy into the collective story of the West from a very distant thing that didn't properly grapple with this. I mean, this is the thing that I think Ian's always done quite well. She's always said, okay, we need to revive the Christian story, yes, but for me this is a very immediate concern because, I'm married to a Scotsman, my children are half British, and therefore I'm raising them as children of the West, not just because I'm grateful to have come here, but because it's their tradition too. Whereas it felt very much like lots of people were just saying, in the giant airport hangar that we were sitting in, if we just take a kind of like stage-managed airport lounge way of doing things, then we can make diversity work, make multiculturalism work. The best example of this, and I'm more critical of Kemi than perhaps some other people on Courage are, is that she referenced the Michaela School as her ideal model of what liberalism should look like. Now, the Michaela School forces you to be silent when walking through the corridors and is so militantly against Islamic entryism, which I'm obviously opposed to, that they ban prayer in all forms. And it's like, well, we are, despite the two Catholics sitting across the table, we are an Anglican country. We're not a secular country. So the idea that we need militant liberal secularism in order to make imported ethnic tribalism and religious tribalism due to unwanted immigration and diversity work, no, I don't think my culture should be liquidated. Actually, I don't think that's the answer. I think the evangelical Christians and the conservatives like us had a better solution to it.
If indigestible levels of immigration mean that you need to give up those the most precious aspects of your own home culture that can't be reasonably and at scale practiced elsewhere, that only gives you another reason to oppose mass immigration. And so, like, whether she realizes it or not, Michaela she gets very good results in schools, and I applaud her disciplinarian form of pedagogy, but she is a walking advert against going down this road any further than we already have. So yes, I agree with Connor on that. I also think that you can only principles, values, laws, these sorts of things, which were very, very were in the foreground of the sorts of speeches that were being made at ARC, not least in Kemi Badenoch's. Those can really only work if you've got the demographic foundations on the ground to make them work. And to illustrate this, Liberia has had more or less exactly the same constitutional order as the United States since 1847, despite occasional updates. Yet no one would claim in a million years that because they have access to the propositional content of that kind of constitutional law, that they are as much of a success story as the United States is. And I think it's the same with values, it's the same with principles in general. Like, what is the point of making really, really good speeches about the foundation of the West heritage in Judeo-Christian values, so-called, or what's the point in talking about passing tough new laws against Sharia if all of these gains can be reversed or repealed by a Muslim or third world supermajority by the end of the century? You need to have both, not just the ideas, but the preconditions to make them work. The last thing I would say is that if, like, the really Thomas Jefferson knew this. I think he said at one point, the great thing about ideas is that they're like a candle. You can, like, one candle can light another without losing its own fire. So they're open source, they can spread, and this is true. So if ideas and principles were really enough to make countries fly, all you would need to do is make sure that the principles and values are uploaded as open source, and everywhere in the world could download them in an instant, alter their cultural software code accordingly, and become as successful as the West has historically been. There's no real reason historically or geographically to think that can happen. And if it can't happen, if we have no examples of it working in other countries, we would be fools to try it in our own when we've already got pretty secure, culturally cohesive, successful countries. And so it's a reckless gamble on human nature and on human history to hope that you can maintain an intergenerational national project in being on principles and values alone.
Well, this is what Douglas noted. He was like, if you just go, for those of you who have just touched down at Heathrow, jumped on the Elizabeth line and walked into the Excel Centre, you might not know you're in London. And especially if you step outside the Excel Centre, you certainly wouldn't know you're in London. You think you've taken a wrong turn into central Lahore because this is an Islamified ghetto in East London. If you walk down the street, there's a charming city full of history and culture that actually belongs to the people to whom you prefix before values, the British. And there are no British people present here, therefore like this talk of British values and the Western story just will fall on deaf ears. And so if people aren't listening to your story, they're not going to tell themselves it, especially if they feel that they have another story which belongs to them and a distinct people. And the other point that he was making is about the great deculturation. In direct proportion to increasing ethnic, racial, which is unfortunately a proxy for religious and cultural diversity, there has been a waning of the cultural influence, a shying away purposely from the top from the distinct identities of the British people, from Christianity, from our settled cultures, from our identities. And we've turned it into this modish platitude invented by the Department of Education in 2014 of British values, which just means tolerance, respect, the rule of law. And it's like, right, so our identity now has to be thinned out in order to encompass people that have absolutely no inclination to adopt it. And also we're offering them a watered down version, so the genuine people that do want to move here and become a part of it, like I am, don't actually feel that they belong to that version of it either. So it's not going to be successful. It disenfranchises the people that actually live here. It estranges our friends who might want to move here in small numbers, and it just appeases the people that would like to see our culture either eradicated into a bland airport lounge or the Islamified ghetto of East London.
Well, Douglas was very disparaging about my East London. I did have to defend it a couple of times and tell him
Did you do so in Arabic?
No. There are some nice parts of Bow, and the rest of it. I mean, he was rude about like the actual place, like some of the buildings, but whatever. But the point you guys are making is sort of broadly correct, and you could definitely feel when Kemi was making her speech the sort of energy leave the room when she sort of had that few lines where she was asserting the secular values of this country. This is a secular country, in a room full of Christians who were thinking, I don't know, there's a lot of energy for that kind of rhetoric, and it just seems misplaced. With the Michaela School, I mean, that's another sort of institution which I would like to sort of partially defend as well, for the reasons that I think it's absolutely necessary but not desirable.
Yes.
Which obviously I think you think too. I mean, I've spoken to Catherine multiple times. I think what she's doing in that area of London, the sort of the level of discipline in that school. I have a few friends who teach in that school, and they love teaching there. Yeah. And I have friends who teach in really, really horrid schools where they've been abandoned, who are not teaching actually. They're sort of substitute parents for kids who are just completely out of control.
She's effective,
and she's effective.
Unchallenged integrity, but right. I would simply.
But it's like what I was going to say. It's sort of like the state of Singapore. I mean, there are a lot of people on the right who fawn over Singapore,
Usually
and I grew up going there and things. It's a great place, I mean, it's sort of first world, raised from the forest, right?
Yes.
But it's highly bureaucratic. It's highly managed. It's this sort of flattened culture by design to manage sort of various ethnic, cultural tensions.
And even then, they have a hard cap on demographic.
And even then, exactly. And even then, they're very, very strict, and they don't tell you how they do it, but they manage their immigration system to ensure, and they manage their housing system, to ensure that you don't have ghettoized pockets of people. And so, you go to Singapore. I admire Lee Kuan Yew. I think he's one of the great figures of history. But you don't want to need a Lee Kuan Yew.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
You don't want to have a Michaela School. So I think credit where credit's due, obviously, but the point still stands.
Well, absolutely, Luke. You're completely right about that, and you're right to say that it may, under certain undesirable conditions, be necessary, but that doesn't make the conditions themselves desirable. It's like saying that maybe the Balkans needs UN peacekeeping troops. Well, yeah, maybe it does, but maybe it would be better if we hadn't turned the very settled culture that we used to have in Britain into a balkanized place that required this sort of treatment. But the other thing is, I could be getting Michaela wrong here, so I don't want to misquote or misrepresent her opinions, but as far as I haven't seen her say that she wants to freeze Britain's demographics in aspic, which is what they do in Singapore. So it's not just that they don't have it's not just that they have a fairly restrictionist immigration policy. They have an immigration policy which is pretty similar to the one that existed in America and that was instituted in America in 1924, which wasn't designed to which was designed to prefer certain forms of immigration over others, but purely graded to what level of demographic balance that part of the world already had in the country at that time. So let's say, for example, I'm making this up from scratch, but a rough policy like this: if you've already got sort of 5% of the population which is from southern Italy or the Mediterranean, then 5% of your immigration each year will come from that group. So it wasn't so much about preferring certain, like ruling out certain groups in toto, so much as making sure that the demographic balances between those groups in America, as constituted demographically in 1924, persisted. Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew consciously did a similar thing after transforming after British colonialism, and he even said explicitly, yes, Singapore would be a better country if we were 100% Han Chinese, but we're not. We're about 73% Han Chinese, and we just want to preserve that balance and all of the different demographic groups that lie under that as well. And Singapore's demographics, in terms of proportions, have barely budged since that happened. And so if Michaela started coming out against that, then she could be compared favourably with Singapore. But as far as I have seen, she's not even in favour of doing that.
The contrary, actually. At ARC in 2023, she said that we are a multicultural nation and that the Michaela School's tactics are what we need to make it work.
Right.
And it's like, right, well, I'd actually don't want a headmistress government arbitrating between every single interaction to ensure that my culture doesn't brush up against someone else's culture, and we need to take this to the High Court every time that we fall out.
Right, yeah, but in fairness to Catherine, she does comment on sort of like the state of the country, obviously, but her primary concern is education. She's an educator.
That's
exactly
she's
right.
very effective,
and she is also correct. She is also correct, right? She is also correct. This is a multicultural country, right? To a degree. Well, I mean, it is now. We kind of want it to be a sort of monocultural country, and sort of the things that she has to do in her school are necessary. Also, generally, regardless of how multicultural or not the school is, I think a lot of her teaching methods are good.
Absolutely,
rote learning,
remembering
the dates, all of the kings and
queens,
all of these sorts of things.
Disciplinarian pedagogy is good. I grant her that much.
Victorian schoolmarming is good, but I'd rather it be for Victorian English children than everyone around the world that then you have to dilute the identity of said children in order to make it work.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, but that's another question about sort of migration, mass immigration,
yes,
which we constantly touch on, right? And we'll sort of talk about sort of probably in more detail and in more depth. We have to. But yeah, I guess that's our sort of summing up of ARC. And unless you had anything else you wanted to say about ARC.
There was I suppose this would be my final thoughts for the episode, is that there was the suggestion that next time around there needs to be, especially because of the youth momentum we mentioned related to the AFD and MAGA and that, a bit more of a cross-generational dialogue, because it wasn't just the people on stage versus the attendees who had slightly different ideas of things. There was a very clear generational divide about the areas of interest and the methods of political redress between, let's just say broadly, the boomers and the zoomers. And the idea has been floated that a boomer-zoomer dialogue is needed on stage next time, because one of the most best attended and praised things was the debate about free trade versus protectionism. I think ARC is best placed to have those kinds of debates, and that would be a very useful one to have.
Interesting. Yeah,
I think that's what we call an audition. On that
really? Yeah.
I'm not saying me. I'm not saying many people.
saying put Connor on the stage. I think that's true. I think that's true, and I think actually it wasn't just sort of like talking to sort of some of the younger people who were saying, these boomers are saying this is classic. It was also like a few of the sort of older speakers saying, there's a lot of young people here. I'm very surprised. Like, what do they think? What do they think? Yes, go and talk to everybody.
We are aligned with the right wing, yes.
But it was interesting, and I suppose I'm looking forward to next year, and hopefully there will be that kind of discussion. Harrison,
thank you.
It was good to have you here.
It was a pleasure.
We'll be glad to have you back.
Great.
Likewise, Connor.
Fun as always.
That's the weekly wrap.